Okay, good morning, folks. My name is Matt Cavanaugh. I'm a dual degree student in law and theology here at Emory. I'm a third year, and I'm your moderator today. And that's about all you need to know about me, because I'm not doing most of this presentation. So I'd like to introduce our two panelists this morning. There might be a third joining us soon. If he does, I will give him a proper introduction as well. But first is Dr. Jordan Greenbaum. Dr. Greenbaum is an alumna of Yale School of Medicine. She's credentialed at 3 hospitals in the area and is an expert on child physical abuse, child neglect, and especially child sex trafficking. And she's a member of a number of national societies on those issues, has published a number of articles. Our other speaker this morning is Ms. Brandy Bazil.
Right.
Bazil. She has been working for the Georgia Care Connection for the past 4 years, as Attorney General Owens mentioned upstairs. The Care Connection is a statewide network that helps survivors of trafficking get hooked into state social services and communities, everything from healthcare, high school education, group therapy, all those things. And Ms. Bazil works face-to-face with survivors of trafficking. So the theme here is victim rescue. That's, of course, focusing on issues of education and awareness, spotting who's in need, but then also getting them out and getting them into a brighter future. So, Dr. Greenbaum, I'll let you take the first crack at presenting, and then Ms. Bazil will. We'll then open up the floor for questions. So, come up with a couple while they're talking, and we'll have a good conversation.
Okay, thank you. I'm the medical director at the Blank Center for Safe and Healthy Children, which is a medical program at Children's Healthcare in Atlanta that provides 24-hour coverage for children who are.
I'd like to introduce Mr. Joel Thornton. Mr. Thornton is our third panelist today. He is the former Chief of Staff at the Georgia Department of Education. While he was there, he organized statewide conferences that trained hundreds of educators in identifying possible victims of sex trafficking and helping them to transition out. Mr. Thornton is also the president and CEO of the International Human Rights Group, a group that promotes religious liberty and an end to child trafficking worldwide. So, Mr. Thornton, thank you for joining us. Dr. Greenbaum, sorry for the interruption, but if you would go ahead and continue with your presentation, and then we'll go ahead and just keep working through.
Okay. So basically, the program that I'm affiliated with is at Children's Healthcare, and we provide 24-hour coverage for children who are suspected victims of child abuse and neglect. For the last several years, we've developed a program for child sex trafficking because we've been aware of the multidisciplinary task force in Georgia that sort of come together and facilitated a response to child sex trafficking. And we are working to get a medical response that's appropriate for kids who are victims of labor and sex trafficking. As you can imagine, I'm not sure, I wasn't present for all of the introductory session, but just you can imagine kids who are involved in sex trafficking are often subjected to extreme violence. They have injuries ranging from sexual assault, gang rapes, particularly violent sexual contact, a lot of physical assaults for methods of control and intimidation. They're essentially assaulted by the exploiters, by buyers, by other people involved in the trade. They also are at risk for sexually transmitted infections, for untreated medical conditions. Kids who come from other countries may have a high rate of tuberculosis, for example, in their home country, high HIV rate if they've been, especially if they've been prostituted in their home country before they brought here. So there are a lot of unidentified healthcare needs, and we see these kids for one reason or another. Many of them, I think, come to adult facilities. It's easier to fly under the radar screen if you don't bring a sex trafficking victim to a children's hospital. So we don't see some of those kids, but we do see a fair number of children who are brought in by law enforcement as runaways, for example, and it's determined they are also being trafficked. Or we see a kid sometimes come in for acute sexual assault and then find out that they've been trafficked, and that it's not just a single sexual assault, they're victims of trafficking. So the medical response is an important part of the rescue and rehabilitation part of the phase of sex trafficking, because these kids really need a medical exam promptly to address their immediate medical needs and then also follow up with long-term medical needs. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the medical response as it is in Georgia and what we've done to develop it, working with lots of different organizations. So in most cases, when we identify kids, we're going to be coordinating with law enforcement, which is going to be LE on the, from now on, LE is the acronym, and Child Protective Services at least. In Georgia, we're mandated reporters to report any suspected child sex trafficking. It's considered a form of child abuse. So they're always involved as well. We provide 24/7 coverage at our emergency departments and in 2 sexual abuse clinics to provide immediate medical exams, rape kits for criminal investigation, obtain medical history. If the child is able to be forensically interviewed and in a position to want to talk about it, she can be interviewed in the emergency department or at our clinic. We have specific nurse practitioners and social workers who are trained to deal with kids who are victims of sex trafficking. So let me just take you through what might happen on any given night. Let's say, I think the Attorney General was talking about the final 4. So let's say somebody calls in, those 5 girls that walked into the hotel room, and somebody called 911, okay? Law enforcement comes out, realizes that these kids are victims of sex trafficking. What would they do? They would bring them for a medical exam. It would be very important for them to have an immediate medical exam, not only for their medical needs, but also for the investigation. So what we've designed is a system whereby law enforcement calls the Children's Health Care Transfer Center and says, we're bringing 5 kids to the Scottish Rite Emergency Department or to Hughes Spalding Emergency Department. Fine. They're victims of sex trafficking. Fine. So then the transfer center person calls one of our medical providers who's trained in doing sexual assault exams, and she calls our social worker. Everybody converges on the emergency department at the same time, hopefully, so that we can cut down on the waiting time. So the law enforcement brings those 5 kids. There's a nurse practitioner who can do the exam and a social worker who can do the evaluation. When we do the exam, we typically do a head-to-toe exam to document injuries and to find out if there are untreated medical conditions. We do an acute anogenital exam to look for sexual assault injuries and test for sexually transmitted infections. While we're doing all that, we're also calling Child Protective Services so they can start getting their act together and figuring out where does the child belong? Can they go home, or are they running away from home because it's unsafe and it's not a reasonable thing to take that 15-year-old back home? And if they can't go home, where do they go? They call Georgia Care Connection. Brandy's going to talk about that in a minute. That is the critical, absolutely critical phone call above and beyond law enforcement and CPS, is to call the Georgia Care Connection and say, hey, we've got 5 victims who need services. And immediately they start thinking, okay, what are we going to do for food and clothing and shelter? How are we going to get these kids overnight? And then also, what are we going to do with them for the next 6 months? So they can start working on that while the medical exam is being done. So essentially, it's a multidisciplinary response in the emergency department. When it works really well. When it doesn't work, we try to stop and think about the next day and say, okay, what happened? You know, why were they sitting there for 5 hours before we just, figured out what to do? So it doesn't always work, but when it does, it works really well. Just a couple of words about the medical response. When we interview the child, our nurse practitioner asks a number of detailed questions. This is not a forensic interview in the sense that we're asking exactly who were the Johns, exactly when and where the criminal activity took place, and how you can identify people, and all the things that are essential to criminal investigation. It's not that. It's much more of an assessment of the physical and emotional needs of the child, because these kids are victims of very complex psychological trauma and psychological abuse, typically physical and sexual abuse as well. So they've got a lot of unmet needs. So we are asking them why they're there. If it's an acute sexual assault, we want to deal with that. Sometimes kids will come because they've got a vaginal discharge. They come because they've got gonorrhea. It's not because they're picked up from the final floor by law enforcement. They're coming for an acute treatment for their gonorrhea. So we ask about why they're there and treat that condition. And then we ask some very detailed questions about reproductive history to find out whether those kids have been pregnant before or pregnant now, whether they've had abortions and complications of abortions, if they've had prior anogenital injuries from prior sexual assaults. We're asking about prior injuries from abuse, from childhood physical abuse, which may be the reason why they ran away from home, or physical abuse that might occur while they're in the exploitation life. We do a mental health screen. Many of these kids have post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, major anxiety disorders. And so we need to screen for suicidal behavior, for example. And it's not unusual to have someone who's actively suicidal and requires emergent psychiatric admission. And then finally, we ask about high-risk behaviors, including drug use and substance abuse, because sometimes kids have drugs in their system, and we need to monitor them for withdrawal symptoms or get them into drug rehab. We document for the full medical exam. Many of these kids will have evidence of injury that needs documentation, both for the criminal investigation, also for medical treatment. Since they may have been victims of physical assault, they may have closed head injury, they may have broken bones, they may have scars from being restrained or hit with whips or hangers or cords or baseball bats. So there's lots of different ways kids can get injured and lots of different injuries they can have. We do urine drug testing, which is really important. A lot of these kids are actively using drugs as a way to help them get through the night. This helps them just deal with very, very stressful life they have. In other cases, the exploiter will encourage them to become addicted to drugs. It's a great way to control somebody, is if you make them addicted to heroin. So we do a drug screen. We do a sexual assault kit and a very detailed sexual physical exam of the genitalia to document injuries and to get DNA and forensic evidence. One of the important things that we do is to screen for sexually transmitted infections, which are very common. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, for example, are very common, trichomonas. And then we treat prophylactically. We assume that the child may turn around and run away again, and we may not be able to get her back for follow-up. So if we see her that night in the emergency department, that may be the only time we see her. So we treat her as if she had gonorrhea, chlamydia, and trichomonas, so that at least at that point she's treated. And then we test for other things like HIV and syphilis. And then one of the most important things we do is provide referrals. A lot of kids need psychiatric referrals. They may need medical referrals. They may need surgical referrals if they have severe injury. So we can tell the Georgia Care Connection, hey, not only do they need these things that you deal with, but they also need these medical referrals. They need to be referred to an obstetrician because, by the way, she's pregnant. Those kinds of things. So that's what we typically do. Currently, we're serving kids at 3 emergency departments of children's health care within Atlanta, but we really should be able to extend our services to train people to be able to do that in emergency departments all over the state so that they can both screen for sex trafficking and respond appropriately. One of the big challenges we have is that there's no clinically validated screening tool that medical providers can use. They can't ask 5 questions and have a 70% chance of picking up victims. There is no tool, so it's very difficult to identify. I'm going to stop now because I think I've talked enough.
Okay, Ms. Bazil, let's hone in on that Georgia Care Connection entry into these cases.
Right, and as Matt introduced Georgia Care Connection a little bit, we are governed by the governor's office, an initiative of the governor's office to be a statewide service for these children who have been victimized. We have received referrals from all different types of places, such as Department of Juvenile Justice. We received referrals from CHOA, Children's Hospital. We received referrals from schools, school social workers, some parents, even some victims themselves have called in and asked for help. So from all different places we've been able to receive referrals. The more we get out with the help of the governor's office doing trainings and getting the community aware about sexual trafficking, the more referrals we have coming in. Up to this day, we have Georgia Care Connection started in 2009, June of 2009, and currently we have received 660 referrals into our office. And those 660 referrals are not international children. These are children who have been trafficked and raised and mostly born in Georgia and trafficked in Georgia, and not trafficked by international men either, but Georgia men. And 660 are not all victims. A lot of these are actually at risk. And a lot of our children we find are at risk because we were saying so prominently how easy it is for children to be as the Attorney General said, it's really easy for them to be picked up and put out in traffic very easily. And so, again, that's why we do have such large numbers, and that's in that area. The Georgia Care Connection has a, right now, budget to hold about 7 employees. Out of these 7 employees, about 5 of us actually work with the victims and clients. And so therefore, that's again why community awareness and community involvement is very important, because there's no way that 7 people can do what's needed to do for either those 400 at risk to not become victims, and those 250 who are already victims would help them into becoming successful citizens. And what we do have is we have executive director, a administrative assistant. We have care coordinators. Our care coordinators receive the referral, they call back either the probation officer, the parent, whomever it is that put in the referral, and ask, well, why are you referring this child to us? Try to find out some background information. They go out and do an interview with the child, and this is a lot like Dr. Greenbaum described, same type of family history. Well, we go into family history, sexual history, and abuse and things of that nature. If you have not heard already, 80 to 90% of the victims have already been sexually abused as children, usually without inside the home or a family member or someone they know. And so from there, the care coordinator maybe finds that this child needs that safe home is not a safe place for her. Maybe home is a safe place for the child, and then we try to find services that are mental health services that are known, that have education on CSAT, commercial sexual exploitation, because of the fact that these victims have had so much trauma in their life. They need a certain type of care rather than that child who might have only been victimized by one perpetrator in their life, but we're talking about a child who had 10 to 20 perpetrators each night for 2 years, 3 months, God knows. And so from there, we try to also, we have a family support specialist who tries to help the parent, if the parent is not the perpetrator, of course. Usually, as again, the Attorney General said, sometimes the child comes home and now that parent is another perpetrator, attacker onto that child when they're calling her a whore or something of that nature, but she has actually been a victim. And so the family support tries to help that parent understand how much their child is a victim, and to understand what made their child at risk, and hopefully make home a safe place for the child. As an intervention specialist like myself, we have 2 intervention specialists who are able to connect one-on-one with these victims and hopefully to give them a glimmer of hope. We are survivor leaders who show them that even though this might have happened to you for 5 years by 500 men or more, you can live a different life. There are different options. And the great thing about that is that we get to follow them throughout their journey. A lot of young ladies do not leave the life, or they just haven't left the life yet. As Matt said, been working with Georgia Care Connection since it started 2009 for 4 years. Have still relationships with young ladies that I started with 4 years ago who are currently still in the life. But even if they don't think they're going to get out, I believe they'll get out. As long as I believe that they'll get out and they see that I believe that they'll get out, there'll always be a little glimmer of hope. And so those are the type of things that we try to install Georgia Care Connection tries to show them a different direction, a new direction. In a lot of cases, it's a generational thing, whereas cultural-wise, there is the understanding that you got to get it how you can get it. There's an understanding that I might not ever get a job because I don't even have the skills to fill out the application. There's an understanding that my mom sold her body, my dad sold drugs, and so therefore, what's my choices? Only thing I know what to do is sell my body. Or there is also very, very much so victims that come from two-parent households. The parent can be a doctor and the other parent can be a lawyer. But that child goes out to find some fun in another different way, or try to find some excitement, and falls into sexual exploitation. And so that's why, again, a lot of our children are at risk. The predators know what to prey on to find what exactly the children may need. And not to be, we are talking about children today, but here we are on a college campus. It has to be said, you have to know that there are college children that are preyed on because you need money, you need to get things done as a student, and they prey on students in order to either dance in clubs or go from dancing in clubs or dancing in private parties or doing something sexually, it's sexual for favorites. So not only children are at risk, but there are people that prey on college students also. Because we do serve 11 to 17-year-olds, I do have some high school students that say that they were recruited on the app of, don't you need to make money for college? They're about to graduate 12th grade, and the predator says, I can show you how to make a lot of money for college. And easily they're pulled right in. And so of course they already been accepted in college, go off into that college life, but they have a two stories or two-phase life. One, at night I'm doing this, and then the day I'm at school. So that's
Mr. Thornton, just before we get started, did you have any multimedia?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, all right. What role do schools play, on that note, of identifying possible victims and of helping them to transition?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we looked at the Georgia Department of Education was we have 1.6, 1.7 million children from kindergarten to 12th grade that are under our care that don't know anything about this, because this is one of the greatest secrets of the modern world, that this is going on in Atlanta. I mean, when I first found out about it, I thought, well, yeah, it's because of the airport and the international people flowing through. But as I began to look at it and realize that it's actually happening, as Brandy said, it's happening in our state by people from our state who are the traffickers and the victims, we realized that we had a moral obligation to help educate not only the children, but also the teachers and the parents in how vulnerabilities are created, how to avoid being vulnerable, how to put yourself in a situation where you're better off not going into certain places, and all of that's about education. So we have one task at the Georgia Department of Education, that's to educate these children. So we looked at it and said, if we're educating them on how to read, how to do their math, how to do their science, how to do their social studies, and we can argue over how well we're doing all that. Some people think we're doing okay, some people think we aren't, but I would assume some of you guys probably came from Georgia Public Schools and made it into Emory University, so way to go. So we're doing some things right, and there's no question about that. We can do a lot of things better. But we looked at it and said, we've got to find ways to help these students avoid these issues, because it's not just an inner city problem, it's a rural problem in Georgia as well. It's a problem across the state. So we began by having some conferences to educate teachers, counselors, school resource officers, the people who are on campus every day interacting with students, who know who the vulnerable students are, who know who the troubled children are, who know exactly who are the most likely people to get engaged in this type of activity. We began talking to them, and then we expanded out and began working with different nonprofit organizations. One of the beautiful things about this is there's an incredible wealth of people who are working in these areas now. There are a lot of nonprofits who have their own independent fundraising. Their whole goal is to try to end this, to try to help educate people. They're creating stuff. So we set out and said, let's see how we can do this without using taxpayer funds. We used some taxpayer funds for some of the conferences because we felt they were that important. But for the curriculum development, even for developing a club structure for high schools and middle schools, so that when you have a student club organizations on your campus, you can now have a stop club, or you can have some other sort of anti-trafficking club on your campus that meets with the campus. So we worked with different groups, Roswell Rotary, the 821 campaign, and other people to develop curriculum for these clubs so that these students could form their own clubs, student-led clubs, where they're interacting with their peers and they're talking about these issues, because I think one of the most important things you can do, it's critical that we continue to rescue people and that we continue to provide all of these services. That is one of the most critical things I think that the state has to do and that nonprofit organizations have to do as well. But what if we could start going upstream and keep these kids from getting engaged in the trafficking by educating their teachers, educating their parents, and educating them? So we're also working with the Georgia Parent-Teacher Association statewide, and with Street Grace, who is actually providing training at local PTA meetings to train parents and teachers who gather in those meetings to spend 30 minutes to an hour at Street Grace's expense. They're traveling all over the state and doing this. They develop the training. They go in and they train these parents and these teachers on what to look for in their communities, how to talk to their kids about these issues, how to make sure that they're doing everything they can to keep kids from being vulnerable. We're also working on with a couple of organizations to develop curriculum that can be used by teachers in the classroom. That's self-guided, it's all internet-based, so that a teacher can go on and spend a couple hours in a health class, spend a couple hours in a social studies class, spend a couple hours in whatever class the school system and the local schools decide it needs to be offered, and offer a course for these students that talk about all these things, that talk about the vulnerabilities, but talk about how to avoid those, talk about how to build your own self-esteem, and all of the things that are necessary. But it's really a matter of awareness. If you know that if you're walking into a mall and you're a 14, 15, 16-year-old lady, and someone comes up to you and says, wow, you're beautiful, you did a great job putting on your makeup today, I'd like to talk to you because I run a modeling agency and we're always looking for makeup artists. If you don't know, and you're in a nice upscale mall, like Phipps Plaza, or the Mall of Georgia, something, you're not in a mall where you're feeling nervous at all, and you don't know that that is quite possibly a luring technique, then you're going to just say, well, I'll just go to the first meeting and see what happens, and before you know it, you found yourself in trouble that you can't get out of. So what if we educate these girls and boys now on what's happening and how these things occur? So that's on the front end. Education is what we do, and we felt like we owed it to these kids, to their parents, and to the teachers, to give them the tools that they need to be able to avoid these issues and to keep from getting themselves in the situation. Because obviously, the fewer people that get into this life, the fewer people that we have on the back end to rescue. And that's, while everybody's doing a great job, and it's an incredible effort that's going on in Georgia, what you may not know is Georgia's leading the nation in this effort, in the concerted nature of this effort between governmental agencies and nonprofits and for-profits and all of the people that are engaged. Georgia is establishing the model that California and the rest of the nation are looking at for how do we do this in an effort that gets across what typically are hard to cross over agency battles. Because I want everybody to be dealing with my agency, you want everybody to be dealing with your organization, you want everybody to be dealing with your organization. Well, in Georgia, all these organizations have come together and said, we just want to play our part. And if our part is educating the kids, we want to do that. Now, the other side of this is on the back end. Once these girls have been either at risk or have actually been involved in the life, they need some way to get back to a sense of normalcy, and they need the medical exams, and they have to have the counseling. But the other thing they need is they need to have a way to get back engaged in their education. Because we all know that without some sort of education these days, a high school diploma is not worth a lot on the job market anymore. It takes some sort of post-secondary degree, whether it's technical college or some type of certification program or it's actually university, it takes something more to get ahead now. And if you can't even get your high school diploma, how are you going to have the vision to get ahead? So one of the things that we're doing at the department, and we're working with Georgia Care Connections on this as part of the task force, is identifying some of these at-risk girls, helping them to take the exams they need to get into college, because I was shocked actually. When we first started this, I thought we would need to help them figure out how to get into technical school or how to get into cosmetology. But the first 4 girls that we started looking at all had a dream to go to college, to go to university. So they needed to take the ACT, they needed to take the SAT, and they had been keeping up with their high school work, most of them. I was shocked at that too. I thought we had to do a whole lot of remedial work and a whole lot of bringing them along, but it turned out that this first group we were working with was actually prepared to graduate and wanted to go to college and needed help. So we're helping them with that. But one of the things that we could do is through the charter school movement, there's a couple of virtual online charter schools. One of them, Provost Academy, is a partner with the task force. They actually are working with Magic Johnson and his big bridge builders. I can never remember the name of it. It's an after-school dropout prevention program that targets high-risk kids and kids who have already dropped out and tries to recover them and help them get back on track with a high school diploma. It's something that Magic Johnson is doing through his foundation that he built up during his time playing professional basketball. He's giving back to the community. He's setting up 7 of these in areas all around Georgia. Well, the Provost Academy is working with them and providing facilities for them in Atlanta, but they also provide a way for these young ladies and young men now to go to school without having to step back into a classroom. We're using this with Covenant House as well, which recovers a lot of homeless people and some traffic as well, but they're really a lot more in homeless youth. What we're doing with them is providing these girls a way to actually go to school without having to step back in the classroom and deal with all of the stuff that goes with being a homeless person in a public school classroom or being a victim of sexual exploitation in a public school classroom. They can recover themselves in a very non-threatening environment right where they already are. So we're working on all of that, and we're just thrilled to be playing a part in what's going on.
Okay, well, I'd like to open up the floor now for questions. I imagine there are quite a few.
Okay, Ms. Brandy, this is actually, I guess, more directed to you, just because my main question would be is, you mentioned that there are the family specialists that try to decide whether or not that if the girl is able to go back home, or even if that's a safe area or something like that. But my other question would be is, like, if the family isn't an option, where do they go? Because I was a part of the Georgia foster care system. I aged out when I was 18, and most foster homes didn't have the education, knowledge, or ability to handle my problems, obviously, which were minuscule in comparison to this. But I just don't feel like foster homes or homes or anything like that would have the need or like everything that would require to take in somebody like this, even if they were under 17 and they did fit the mold and were able to go into child protective services. I don't think the foster parents would be equipped to handle somebody with like this disruptive of a background, or without encouraging the girl just to run away again.
Great question. I'm gonna stand up because it's a thing.
Okay.
First of all, the family support specialist does not make the decision if the child goes home or not. A lot of times, especially if they're picked up by law enforcement, in a lot of different investigations, either with forensics and things from CHOA or DFACS, things other people finds out if the child should go home or not. And in some cases, it is okay to go home. In the cases that they cannot go home, currently Georgia does have residential beds in order to put these children in. There are only a few residential beds if they are fit for that, and then they go into a treatment facility. What you brought up in regards to foster care and things of that nature, foster care children are very much at risk because of those issues that the foster care parents don't know how to deal with those issues. And that is why we are trying to work with Department of Children's Services to educate foster parents so that those children become less at risk. So there's a lot of education going on, but there are currently residential treatment facilities for some youth to be able to receive that. Unfortunately, it's not long term. You can't stay forever. It's about 10 to 8 months usual care, and they return back home. So hopefully with family therapy and things of that nature during this time, that home becomes a more safe place for them to return to.
Did either other panelists want to chime in on this, or shall we move on to the next question?
I think she did a great job.
Okay, next question it is. Yes.
I can relate with what Mr. Thornton said just about the malls and safe places that girls will go. Because when I was 13 and 14, I was approached by 2 older men about your beautiful photography, blah, blah, you should be a model. Weird, sketchy things. But I was wondering from each of you, have you noticed or found that there are people who come into your organizations or want to volunteer or get involved with the issue that are masked as rescuers but really perpetrators? And how have you dealt with that? And are there policies and laws for people who are wanting to help with this really vulnerable population when all they have to do most of the time is fill out just a volunteer sheet, get a background check? And how do you separate the fakes from people who are actually agents of rescue?
I can start by answering that. At Children's, of course, that's a big concern, is to have to make sure that any volunteer is vetted very carefully for any prior history of child sexual abuse or high-risk behavior. Of course, you can't be absolutely certain, and there are limitations to the databases. You can check the criminal background check on so many states, but not necessarily other states, and there's definite limitations. But I think that for as much as they can, they undergo a very careful background check on that. I can't speak for other NGOs or for-profit organizations.
One of the things we do is we don't allow anybody access to the students. If you have a curriculum or you have some ideas, you have to go through our process, and we vet it, and then we provide it to the teachers who then teach the children. We have people going to come in and teach in the classroom these issues, and we just said that's what teachers are here for. They're certified to be here. They're going to be here. Now, volunteers at a local level are controlled by the local school, and they have a very involved process. There's a lot of things they have to go through, and I'm sure they miss them from time to time. That's where the greatest vulnerability probably is right there at the local school level.
It's very difficult because people who are traffickers are master manipulators, and that's how they get good at what they're doing. And so it's very, very hard to pick up somebody like that. And so all the background checks in the world may not pick that person up, and that's why they're so good at scooping up adolescents, but also manipulating adults.
Georgia Care Connection doesn't really pull in volunteers right now, and so a lot of our employees are actual, like we said, a few of them, only 5 work with the victims from our office, and in lots of cases, our family support specialists and for intervention specialists, you have had to have had some history. Family support specialist, she had a child who was victimized, and so with coming out of that and having that type of experience and history and passion for the work, you kind of feel who you're working with and working for. Unfortunately, like Ms. Dr. Ringwald said, they are criminal masterminds. And so I have heard of a case where an actual counselor of a girl put her into sex trafficking. And she was a licensed counselor. And so it can happen in any field, in any way. And we could take all the measures that we possibly can. And just like, the educational department, I'm sure you hear of teachers doing things to children. They take all the measures that they can possibly can. I think that a lot of things, we have to really stand together as a community and protect children as a community. When we understand that children should not be in a closed facility getting even a lesson from a teacher, from an instructor, from let's say a pool lesson, one-on-one. Things like having a child with an adult one-on-one, or sometimes one adult and 5 children. All those 5 children can be victimized at the same time. But being able to have more than one adult accountable to each other and things of those natures to help protect our children as a community.
My name is Renee Barron. I'm a student here at Emory, and I was curious about the initial screenings and evaluations, and how do you ensure that you're getting accurate information from somebody who may have been threatened against going to authorities, may be scared of authorities, may have prior, instances with the law, and is worried about getting in trouble herself? How do you make sure that the story that you're getting is accurate?
Most of the time, the story that we're getting, you're right, is not accurate, it is not true. A lot of times, the children do not know what verbal, sexual, emotional abuse are, because abuse is so normal. Violence is so normal in our society. They don't know what those are. So sometimes it takes some time to actually educate them on what those are, so they can realize, oh, I am a victim. Oh, that was wrong that happened to me. And especially if you grow up and daddy tells you that this is what daddies and daughters do all the time, then they don't know what the normal society is. They have to unlearn unhealthy behavior and learn healthy behavior. So sometimes that does take time. How do you know? A lot of times we have intuition, that's all we can go off of, but only thing we can do is kind of be able to be there, caress them, and show love and care, and that we will be here. They have probably already been questioned by 5 DFACS workers, 3 probation officers, and God knows too much.
I think that we sort of take it as an assumption that we're not going to get the truth when we start interviewing somebody, because there are so many reasons why kids are not going to want to come forward. They don't. I think Brandy's number one thing is they don't see themselves as victims. If you said you're a sex trafficking victim, they look at you like you're nuts, because they feel that this guy is their boyfriend and that they're very loyal to him and he's looking out for them, even though he does beat her up every once in a while. Occasionally he buys her something, and so there's this real bond. It's almost like a domestic violence relationship, and so they're very much. Many kids are very much drawn to their trafficker and very loyal, and so they're not going to say to somebody in the emergency department, yeah, that guy's trafficking me. They don't see it that way. They may be very scared, and in many cases there are threats made to them or to their family. And so for any number of reasons, they are not going to necessarily tell us the truth or be forthcoming with information. I think in many cases, unfortunately, even in medical situations, people treat them with a lot of judgmental comments and derogatory comments, and saying things like, well, if she weren't such a bad kid, she wouldn't get herself in this situation, wouldn't she? And I've heard those kinds of things. And so knowing a child, knowing that that's what's going to happen, it is not going to be forthcoming about what's going on. However, having said that, in many cases, surprisingly, kids are very upfront, and they'll start talking about once you get going, you build a rapport with the child, and you're talking for a while, you're doing your exam, and they'll start talking about how much they've been beaten up were forced to service 5 to 10 guys a night and have been sold by 1 or 2 other people. And they can be very forthcoming, but I think in many cases they aren't. And I want to give an example of one that was fairly recent. I was doing this via telemedicine, so I was talking to the person over the telemedicine. I had learned before from law enforcement that the 16-year-old girl had been trafficked and sold by 3 or 4 different traffickers in the last 4 years. So she had really been through the ringer for 4 years and had just found out she was pregnant for the 2nd time. She had been picked up and was at the juvenile detention center. They found out she was being trafficked, so they brought her to the Child Advocacy Center for an exam. Okay, so I know that basic information talking to her. But when she talks to me, she's happy-go-lucky, and she's saying, yeah, I'm out on the street, I prostitute myself because I want to. I like it. I think it's fun. I can keep all my money. I can say no anytime I want. My boyfriend wants me to do it, but I don't have to do it. I can just back out anytime I want. And darn well that's not the truth. But in her mind, she's going to say that to me, and she may in part believe it as a way to have some measure of self-esteem and self-control, feeling like she's got some control over her life. And so the most we can do is take down the information, try to build a rapport, try to open the door so that they can be forthcoming if they want, and try to give them some information about possible ways of getting help in the future. I see it very much as the same as a domestic violence relationship. The person you're talking to may not be willing to leave the guy who's just beating the crap out of her tonight, but in 4 more emergency departments later, she may be ready to do that. And if we can lay the groundwork and say there are people out there who care, there are resources, there are numbers to call, hotlines to call, you can reach out, maybe next time they will. She may not tell me the truth, but she may tell somebody else the truth the next day or in a week.
In the back, there was a hand up earlier. Okay.
This is from Mr. Gordon. You spoke about the general curriculum that teachers could use to talk about vulnerability. But I'm wondering, there's been this shift in the movement focusing on men, and I'm wondering what the school system is doing about teaching young boys about not becoming buyers in the future.
Well, it's not just young boys becoming buyers in the future, it's young boys being bought.
Right.
And so, it's kind of an asexual curriculum where it's talking about the problem in terms of boys and girls being victims and men and women being perpetrators. And so it's a broad curriculum in that standpoint, that it's not, even though it still focuses mostly on the women, because it's still young girls that are primarily the ones that saw, because let's face it, it's mostly men that are the bad guys here. So it is focused on that, but it does talk about the other, because it's important that our boys understand that they're in danger of being trafficked as well, and that they also understand that it's never appropriate to engage in that sort of behavior. There's no time, there's just no option where prostitution is a good idea from the standpoint of a man buying sex. And I know there's a move, it's particularly big in Europe, to legalize prostitution, and I think it's one of the biggest mistakes a culture can make. I know it sounds good to this kind of open mindset of it's a victimless crime, and you're allowing people to come into it that want to be in it. And in my entire life, I'm 52 years old, I've never met anybody that told me their ambition was to be a prostitute. But I've heard of one person who quit a university job to go out and work the streets of Vienna, Austria, because she wanted to be a prostitute, because she thought it was a great way to make money. One person. It's just not there. When you see it legalized, like in Germany, for the World Cup, the German government brought in 40,000 prostitutes to make sure they had enough to service the country while the World Cup tournament was going on in 2006. South Africa did the same thing. And before we all turn our nose up at all these people, the Super Bowl does the same thing. The NFL doesn't actually, in this case, the German government and the South African government went out and brought them in because it's legalized. In the NFL's case, they just kind of, turn a blind eye or just don't really deal with it because they don't want to upset their crowds. And so I think it's important that we teach these kids, men and women, boys and girls, that this is never an appropriate transaction. It doesn't matter what your culture says. It doesn't matter what anybody around you says. It's never appropriate to pay for sex with anybody.
I have a follow-up question. All right. Have you met any resistance in bringing this curriculum to the school system because it doesn't like to talk about sex and
No, it's not with that. It's the resistance I get is why are we engaged in this? There's ignorant people everywhere, even amongst the most educated amongst us. And I just say, well, I had one person tell me, I can't believe we'd spend a single dollar on this. And I said, well, my daughter's worth it. Is your daughter worth it? They said, yeah. I said, so who is it you're saying it's not worth it? Is it the Latino kids that aren't worth it? Is it the black kids? Well, that's not fair. I said, well, if my daughter's worth it and your daughter's worth it, whose daughter is it that's not worth it? In my opinion, everybody's daughter's worth it. So it's not a real well-voiced opposition because it's just too hard to oppose that kind of discussion. But yeah, there's a lot of people that think we ought to be teaching math and reading and nothing else. And we're not setting up classes. You can't get a credit in high school, a year-long credit over this issue, but you can get enough teaching to understand what vulnerabilities are. But yeah, there's always resistance.
Okay, sir, you had your hand up first from last time, so I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks. I was wondering how, I guess it's a really hard question, but how long do you think it usually takes, or have you seen it take, for these victims that have been through some horrendous stuff and likely have like a lot of PTSD, how long does it take for them in their life to have some sense of like normalcy, or just to have, you know, like not have like nightmares and flashbacks, you know?
Each case is different. Each case is different.
On average.
It's no average. Absolutely.
But you're
it's
talking
not.
about years, and you're talking about possibly never fully recover. It's almost like an addict that you may not be drinking, you may not be using drugs, but you still have to spend every day fighting those addiction urges. This is the same type of behavior. You may have to spend the rest of your life fighting the urge and feel like you're not as good as the person next to you. You feel like there's something you did to bring it on. I mean, that's part of the psychology of it all that I don't think any of us completely understand, but these guys understand enough of it to get these people back to some level of normalcy. There are people that have been involved in this trafficking for years. They go out, marry, have kids, and lead a normal life. But there are also the ones that never can figure out how to put a relationship together, never can figure out how to raise their kids. So it really is different for everybody.
You have to, sorry, and you really have to think about it and normalize it, as in, like me myself, I feel like I've been dealing with a weight issue for decades. It's a cycle of change, stages of change within that, where I can lose some, then gain it back, lose, gain it back. It's about changing I really have to change my whole lifestyle in order to maintain what I really want to maintain. And it also comes from when I was growing up, what I was learning to eat. Now I have to change all over from what I birthed up. So if you really think about it in the aspect of stopping smoking, stopping drinking, any little habit, if you have an issue with focusing and things of that nature, how do you work on that? And how long is it going to take you to be able to focus for a whole, let's say, 3 hours on one particular thing? So it's not that hard to think about how hard it is for change.
I only know of one study that looked at long-term outcomes, and that doesn't mean there aren't more studies out there, but there was one study looking at adolescent women who had been trafficked in Europe. And so it's mostly sex trafficking, some labor trafficking, but all of them have been sexually exploited as well. And they did interviews at the time that the people were rescued, and then I think it was 90 days and 6 months, and interviewed them and found out just subjectively what kinds of signs and symptoms they had. And many of them, something like 80% of them had really bad headaches and a lot of fatigue right away. And then within 3 months or so, many of them, I think it was more like 65% had those persistent headaches and fatigue. And then 6 months out, still a substantial number, and I can get you those numbers if you really want them. But they had a substantial number of women and adolescents still had chronic pain, still had insomnia, still had some sort of PTSD-like symptoms and signs. Now, none of these people were absolutely diagnosed with PTSD. It was more like a subjective signs and symptoms survey and asking them about pain. But there was, while things improved over 3 to 6 months, they still had significant symptomatology, both cognitively and with chronic pain later. How long that would take to completely disappear, I don't know. I think that a lot of that has to do with how much therapy they can get, how effective that therapy is, and what the heck they've been through along the way. Some of these kids have so much baggage when they come in because they've been abused and neglected for 12 years before they even get drawn into the sex trafficking. So that you're really dealing with a lot of things, and if you don't get good therapy, it can really plague the child.
No, yeah, you. Yes.
Just making sure I didn't want to step on anyone's toes. So the education aspect of like training teachers and personnel, is that more of a preventative thing, or is it a finding people who are actually in the sex trafficking now? Because I feel like if I were a sex trafficker, I would not let my kids go to school.
Well, it's surprisingly a lot of kids that are trafficked go to school because it's the one place they can have a normal life and they can get fed at least 2 meals, and they can kind of get back to some sense of normalcy. It's primarily educating kids how not to get engaged, but what happens anytime you do that is a very alert teacher, a very alert counselor will start to see kids that are showing the signs of these issues, because that's part of what the education is about too, is teaching what do you look for. What changes in language do you look for in a 12 or 13-year-old that alert you to the fact that this child is suddenly having a changed relationship that may well be an exploitative relationship. It's how do you look at the differences in the way they dress? How do you look at the differences of what are they, do they have a new pocketbook suddenly that they couldn't have before? They're putting on a lot more makeup than they did before. Do they have an older boyfriend? So it's designed to teach the kids how to avoid becoming a victim, but at the same time, part of that education is teaching the adults in the room how to recognize it when they see it.
Okay, next question. We'll take it from the front this time.
My question is actually for Dr. Greenbaum. I know that a lot of the post sort of sexual trauma like investigation is fairly invasive in itself, and I just wondered how you approach that with a child who's presumably already been traumatized or has had his agency taken away from them.
That is such a good question, and there is abundant literature on sort of like the second rape of people, women and children who have been sexually assaulted, coming in and getting their exam and having been totally traumatized by the medical personnel inadvertently. So we try to make every effort to do a couple things. One is that when we talk to the kids, we start out by, I usually start out by saying, nothing you tell me, anything, let's see, you don't have to answer any of my questions if you don't want to. One of the things that we want to do is give them the control that they haven't had for at least the last several months, if not years. So you say, I say, you don't have to answer any questions you don't want to. And I try to normalize the responses and say, I'm going to be asking you more questions than probably any other medical provider ever asked you, because I need to find out what I need to do to help you with this exam and what kind of referrals you might need and what I might be able to help you physically and with your mental health. I'm not asking just because I'm, just like a voyeuristic thing. I have a reason for asking these questions, but you don't have to answer any of them. And some kids think some of those questions are funny, some of them think they're kind of stupid, and some get angry. However you respond is fine, and you just let me know if you don't want to answer the questions. Fine. Lay the groundwork. You make sure that they know that nothing that they say is absolutely guaranteed to be confidential, because police